Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people coming together again in this dark time, these hard times. I want to welcome you to War by Other Means, the legal, cyber, and economic fronts in the war in Ukraine. This is the second part of our ongoing series dedicated to the crisis in Ukraine. Last week, we gathered amidst shock and horror, and today the reality has only become darker. We come together in search of insight and understanding and wisdom, trying to battle helplessness and to fight against apathy, to better understand the situation and see how we can help as informed citizens and members of the human family. Ukraine is a place with deep connections to many of us on this call. For many, this is the place of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. For others, this is the soil from which the spiritual power of Jewish life arose and keeps on inspiring us, from the Hasidic masters to the Maskilim to the proud refuseniks like Natan Sharansky. And now there's a new chapter unfolding, and we at YU hope that this series can create a space for insight and dialogue. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, the Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, the YU Center for Israel Studies, Yeshiva University Political Action Club, the Dunner Political Science Society, Yeshiva University College Democrats, and Yeshiva University College Republicans. Tonight's video, as well as last week's event, can be found on the Crisis and Hope YU Voices webpage. I'll be putting that into the chat. I ask you to please send your questions in to the Q&A as the discussion unfolds. Each panelist will present their perspective, and then we'll have a chance for a conversation. So please send those questions in. But first, I wanna thank, there are other people I wanna thank as well. We had the honor of Rabbi Ari Berman, the president of Yeshiva University, opening up this series last week. And he understood the power and the importance of this and the importance of bringing together all the different parts of the university. And for that reason, we got together tonight, people from a diverse array of different parts of the university. And I can't think of a better person to introduce us to this topic than our Provost, Selma Botman, who understands the unique nature of Yeshiva University and the wider community. And without any further ado, Provost Botman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ronnie Perelis, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all of the participants that are here with us tonight. Our hearts go out to the Ukrainians for the death and pain and destruction that they are experiencing, and our minds are trying to make sense of the whys and the implications of this unnecessary war. And we ask questions, and tonight's panelists will help us understand much about the conflict. And I also ask you to pay attention to the upcoming panel discussions that we will have this month and next month as well. And we will demonstrate the depth of the knowledge of our faculty. And I want to thank members of our faculty for stepping up and helping us understand this crisis. We ask, will this be a localized crisis, or will there be other flashpoints that will emerge politically, militarily? Will the economic front open up widely in Europe, in the Americas, across the world? And then we ask, what is going to happen as we look at oil and gas and mineral challenges as the exports and imports change? For us at YU, we also ask the question of how the more than 200 Ukrainians who are Jewish or who have Jewish family, how will they fare? And, will the efforts in Israel of Prime Minister Bennett and others attempting at mediation, will those mediation sessions succeed? And who will take in the refugees in Europe and beyond? Israel is taking in some orphans, and other countries will be taking in refugees. Of course, people in Afghanistan want very much to remain in their own societies if possible, but war and destruction has been causing them to flee to other places. So what we will have today is a group of panelists who understand the world deeply and will enlighten us. And as they enlighten us, we will all have to gird ourselves, because there will be more, unfortunately, there will be more bloodshed and more atrocities committed. And so with a heavy heart, I turn this back over to Ronnie Perelis, who will introduce our panelists to you.
Thank you, Provost Botman. Thank you very much. So tonight, we're really lucky to have all three of our panelists. James Kahn, the Henry and Bertha Kressel Professor of Economics, will be focusing on the economic dimensions. Deborah Pearlstein, Professor of Law and co-director of the Floersheimer Center for Constitutional Democracy at Cardozo School of Law, will be discussing the legal front. And Sivan, Tehila, the director of the Cybersecurity Master's Program for the Katz School of Science and Health, will be discussing cybersecurity angles. As all of these, anyone who's read anything about this war understands how this is not only a war of ammunition and jets. This is a very complex modern affair. And really, we thank you so much for being here tonight. So the order will be, we're going to start. Every panelist will present a perspective. Then, like I said, please keep on sending questions. I already see many people sending questions into the Q&A, and then we'll have time for discussion. I want to first introduce James Kahn. James Kahn has been the Henry and Bertha Kressel Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Economics Department since 2009. Before that, he spent 11 years in the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where his last title was vice president. Before coming to the New York Fed, he was associate professor of economics at the University of Rochester. He's also been a visiting faculty member at NYU Stern and UPenn Wharton, and a visiting scholar at Columbia. He has over 30 published articles and has also written commentaries for CNBC and Fox Business. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for being here.
All right, well, I'm going to share my screen, confirm that everybody can see it. Well, thank you, Ronnie and Provost Botman, for including me in this discussion. This is a big topic, the economic fronts and the war, economic warfare. And it's hard to squeeze into 8 minutes. It could fill 8 hours. Though candidly, some of my students might tell you that when I speak for 8 minutes, it feels like 8 hours. But that's only because of the amount of information I cram in. Let me start by just talking about economic warfare in general. It's as old as war itself. It's an integral part of warfare, and it's designed, of course, to weaken the opponent's economy. And there are a lot of different potential measures that can be involved. There's blockade, which is militarily shutting down an opponent's trade, and that's considered an act of war. And I'm sure many of us may recall or be aware of Egypt's blockade of the Straits of Tiran in 1967, which was an act of war preceding Israel launching the attack on Egyptian forces. There's embargo. There's sometimes confusion between the two terms. Embargo is a country's refusal to trade with an opponent, and that's within every country's right. So the US has an embargo of Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We banned Iranian oil imports in response to the 1979 hostage crisis. Another common tactic is freezing or expropriation of assets. We've frozen Iranian assets and thawed them out many times over the last 40 years. In the current situation, the sanctions have been particularly targeting Russia's financial sector. So these include removal of some Russian banks from the SWIFT financial network. Now, the difficult thing is that Europe in particular is very dependent on Russian energy. And so certain banks have been exempted from this so that so that Europeans can pay for imports of Russian energy. So there's always a delicate balance there. Embargoes, bans, we and other countries have banned exports to Russia of certain technology, aircraft and spare parts. We've recently, just the other day, President Biden banned Russian oil imports. There's been a freeze on US-based assets of Russian state-owned banks, so they don't have access to them. Within Russia, payment systems, such as Apple Pay, et cetera, have been frozen. There's been a pretty almost unprecedented financial blockade of Russia's central bank to keep it from selling foreign currencies in its efforts to stabilize the ruble, which has come down a lot, as I'll talk about in a moment. There's bans on US purchases of Russian debt. So what is the intent of all of this? It's causing, or is at least the potential to cause, a liquidity crisis in the Russian financial system. The ruble has declined substantially, depending on when you count, about 1/3 in value. The stock market has collapsed. The Russian central bank has been forced to increase Russian interest rates to 20% in order to incentivize Russians to keep money in the banks. But the problem is that the freezing of payment systems like Visa and MasterCard and so forth, the Russians have been having to take money out of banks because it's become more of a cash economy, and that drains the financial system. Of course, there's been high inflation in Russia, even higher than here. And of course, there's a hardship on the Russian people. The intent is to make it obviously more difficult and politically unpopular for Russia to wage war. And as I mentioned, it's tempered by European dependence on Russian energy. So we don't want to cut off our noses to spite our face, so to speak. So that gets to the point of sanctions have spillover and boomerang effects. So there are risks associated with imposing them. There are still, despite the exemptions, there's potential disruptions to energy exports to Europe, either because banks are hesitant to engage with Russia or because Russia might impose its own embargoes as retaliation. There's some discussion of potential for Russia to default on its debt, which could damage some US and European financial institutions. There are military risks if Russia decides to retaliate militarily or otherwise. There's a potential windfall for China, which is not our friend either, and strengthening of the Russia-China alliance. And Russia could engage in cyber warfare as part of its retaliation. Maybe Sivan will have some comments about that. Obviously, the risks are greater the larger the target. So Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world by most reckonings. So sanctions against a smaller country like Iran were in some ways more potent and have less of this sort of blowback effect. But for a larger economy, especially one that is such a big supplier of energy to the rest of the world, the risks are greater. There's also the potential to bypass sanctions. So there's an ongoing question of to what extent will China bail Russia out? So it could provide liquidity and other financial services to the Russian financial system that are being cut off now. They could import more Russian oil, which would likely reduce their imports from the US. Now there's a view that says that China won't risk this because it would anger the Western countries, and there's a potential risk of sanctions against them if they help Russia. But that's a question. That's an ongoing question. Remains to be seen. there's the possible resort to cryptocurrency as a bypass to the conventional financial system. So so there are both risks, and there are both the potential and the potential for Russia to be able to get around the sanctions through other means. So I want to focus specifically now on the US's embargo on Russian oil and discuss the wisdom of the policy. I'll start with just pointing out that oil is a worldwide market. Now, oil is not completely fungible in the sense that it can end up in the same place regardless of these sanctions. But ultimately, if we don't buy Russian oil, they can still sell it elsewhere, and we will buy it elsewhere. And ironically, elsewhere could include countries like Iran and Venezuela, which are both supporters of Russia, so the political benefits of this are suspect, and at the moment it does seem to be mainly a symbolic act. Now, are there alternatives? Well, Russia benefits from high oil prices, although I understand that Russian oil, because of all the financial sanctions, is actually selling at a discount relative to oil from other countries, but they do benefit from high oil prices. There's been a question buzzing around, could we produce more oil? Normally, the high price of oil, somewhere in the vicinity of $120 a barrel, should stimulate more production. So what are the facts? So this is a graph of, forgive me for throwing this at you, but it's a graph of the blue line here is US oil production. And of course, like everything else, it collapsed during the pandemic. It hasn't recovered substantially, unlike the rest of the US economy. So it's still down about 10%. In addition, our exports have been rising in the last couple of years, while our imports in the orange line here have been rising, and our exports have been flat, basically. So in some sense, we haven't gotten our production back up, and we've become more of an importer of oil. This despite, of course, as everybody knows, oil prices have skyrocketed. Note that they've been rising since late 2020. So this is a trend that has just recently accelerated. I've mentioned these points already. Oil prices are higher. The U.S.'s economy overall has surpassed where it was in pre-COVID, but not oil production. So for reasons unrelated to the war, the Biden administration had enacted measures that inhibited U.S. oil production. They've stopped leasing new oil drilling on federal lands and things like that. So as the U.S., some people may not be aware, is the world's largest oil producer. So this the inhibition of U.S. production might contribute to higher prices and almost certainly increases our imports wherever we import from. So this is something to consider. The policies were, I think, grounded in concerns about the environment and climate change and so forth, and those may be valid reasons, but now we're in a different circumstance, and so possibly those policies should be reconsidered. So I'll just conclude. Sanctions are and will have a big impact on Russia, adverse impact on Russia. There's some potential for backfiring, the spillover and boomerang effects, provocation. There's potential for Russia to mitigate them through their alliance with China. And we need to understand the effects of US energy policy. The embargo may be more symbolic than impactful, and it may not be the right time to be inhibiting US production. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kahn. I know there are already questions coming in, and there'll be more. That was very helpful and clear, and leaves us with more questions. So I look forward to the discussion. Our next speaker is Professor Deborah Pearlstein. Professor of Law and co-director of the Floersheimer Center for Constitutional Democracy at Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University. Before joining Cardozo, Professor Pearlstein was an associate scholar in the Law and Public Affairs program at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs, and held visiting appointments at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and Georgetown University Law Center. Her scholarship on the Constitution's separation of powers and U.S. foreign relations has been published widely in leading law journals and in the popular press, and has been the subject of repeated testimony before Congress on topics from war powers to executive branch oversight. She has served as chair of the AALS National Security Law section, on the ABA's Advisory Committee on Law and National Security, and on the editorial board of the peer-reviewed Journal of National Security Law and Policy. Most recently, she was appointed to the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on Historical Diplomatic Documentation, a 9-member board of historians, political scientists, and international law experts who help ensure the timely declassification of government records surrounding major events in U.S. foreign policy. Magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, Professor Pearlstein clerked for Judge Michael Boudin of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, then for Justice John Paul Stevens of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think it's obvious why we want her here tonight to help us explore some of these big topics, big questions. So thank you so much, Professor Pearlstein, for joining us.
Thank you for including me. I'm assuming you can hear me okay, and will stop me if you can't. Great. Thank you to Provost Botman and Dr. Perelis for putting this together in such short order. I'm happy for the opportunity to be here. Among the many tragedies that are unfolding currently in Ukraine are, as we see even worse today, with every passing hour, the horrific toll that has been taken among the civilian population in Ukraine. Not only, of course, is there an enormous refugee crisis as Ukrainians flee the conflict, but for those who remain, there are already civilian casualties in the hundreds. That number seems likely to be a significant undercount. In any event, the violence continues to unfold. And one of the questions I have had most often in the last few weeks, in addition to questions about prospects for U.S. engagement and U.S. military involvement and constitutional and international law questions surrounding those, are questions about the prospects for criminal accountability. If there are war crimes ongoing as we speak in Ukraine, is there any meaningful way to hold anyone accountable at any point? Isn't that what international criminal justice was designed for? Isn't that what Nuremberg was about? So I thought with these sort of opening remarks, I would address some of those basic questions and then welcome questions and discussion on any of these issues as we have a conversation after. So to do a brief sort of war crimes in International Criminal Law 101, what's a war crime? The short answer to that question is they are things that are listed and described as grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. There are 4 Geneva Conventions and 2 additional protocols, which are additional treaties attached to those treaties. Every country in the world, including Ukraine and Russia, are party to the Geneva Conventions. And each of those provisions describing grave breaches describe a number of kinds of conduct that are prohibited and that count as war crimes, including torture and the use of biological experiments and the taking of hostages and so forth. But the single, sort of the first and the paradigmatic war crime in key respects is the deliberate targeting of civilians in circumstances of international armed conflict, which is what we have now. That is to say, we have an international armed conflict. So the question for a trial or eventual prosecution or the existence of war crimes now is, are the Russians deliberately targeting civilian targets? Can that be established? And even if they're not deliberately targeting civilian targets, although it looks very much like they are from what news accounts I've been able to see. Even if they're not deliberately engaging in that sort of targeting, if they are failing to use precautions, they have a duty under international law to take all feasible precautions to avoid directly targeting civilians and civilian objects. If they are failing to do that, then they are likewise facing facing legal violations. So those will be the sort of factual and legal questions that would arise in any war crimes prosecution, or at least the more straightforward ones that would arise. But the question is, where does this happen? How does this happen? And there are really 4 jurisdictions that might eventually matter here. The first, I should mention, is if Ukraine survives the conflict. Of course, the Ukrainians' criminal justice system, just as the US criminal justice system would function in a post-conflict setting, is entirely capable of pursuing ordinary criminal prosecution against offenders who remain within its jurisdiction. So that's a possibility. That's not a possibility anytime while the conflict is ongoing. Really, as a matter of international law, there are 3 possibilities that I think, in sort of declining order of likelihood, that I think we're likely to see. The first is that a foreign jurisdiction with what's called universal jurisdiction authority would pursue prosecution. So a universal jurisdiction law is a law that targets one of these war crimes or otherwise recognized international crimes. So war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. And we've seen, with increasing success to some extent, states with universal jurisdiction statutes, Germany, for example, successfully pursuing prosecutions of, for example, Syrian officials who engaged in, for example, torture against some of the civilian population in Syria in the course of that conflict. So in the last few months in Germany, there was a successful prosecution of a Syrian lieutenant colonel who was one of the commanders in charge of that operation. This is a success story, right? This is after the fact. But Germany is not the only country with that kind of universal jurisdiction statute. There are many European countries, and indeed countries beyond Europe, that have similar jurisdictions. So if they are ever able to gain custody, that is, if any perpetrators ever travel within the jurisdiction of the European Union or beyond, or in the particular country, they would be subject to that country's jurisdiction. And I'll talk in just a minute after I get these initial options out about likelihood that this will ever actually happen and how this functions in real time. So universal jurisdiction prosecution by another state is one, and perhaps the most likely prospect that we'll see following the conflict. A second possibility is the role of the International Criminal Court. Now, the International Criminal Court is created by treaty called the Rome Statute. It has only been in operation, this sort of standing International Criminal Court, for less than 20 years still, well under 20 years still. The United States is not a party to the ICC. Russia had been and then withdrew its consent. Ukraine is not a party to the ICC. Nonetheless, the ICC is capable of asserting jurisdiction if a situation is referred to it by a country, and already in this situation by a state party to the treaty. And already in this situation, I think 39 different countries, Europeans and others, have referred the matter of Ukraine to the ICC. The ICC prosecutor has announced that he has already launched an investigation, preliminary investigation into the circumstances of Ukraine. This is a good step in the sense that it enables, to some extent, a central clearinghouse and institutional impetus for the critical gathering and retention of evidence, which is hard to think about in a sort of ongoing conflict, but nonetheless, every YouTube video, every sort of cell phone picture that is taken, every signed declaration of refugees who successfully crossed the border into Poland or elsewhere who have witnessed these attacks and these crimes can become potential invaluable evidence. And there's already wonderful work that's being done by NGOs on the ground. And I believe, although this is a question I'll have some of the tech companies to preserve some of this information, this is critical. Whether those cases ever get to the stage of prosecution at the ICC, I think, is a more complicated question, but it is a prospect. The final prospect for what jurisdiction might exist here, what court, which I think is least likely, but is already to some extent under discussion, is the creation of some sort of special tribunal for the war crimes arising out of the violence in Ukraine. This was done following the conflict in Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It was done following the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. And those special courts, which were created by resolution of the UN Security Council, proved to be enormously successful in in pursuing prosecutions, obtaining convictions, and indeed holding accountable some of the most senior perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity in those conflicts. It seems to me less likely that that is a course we'll pursue here. Number one, Russia is a veto-bearing member of the UN Security Council and therefore capable of blocking its creation. The discussion therefore has been that the UN General Assembly might be able to create such a tribunal, or that there might be some other Nuremberg-like treaty created to create a special tribunal for this particular circumstance. That is possible. That is a significant undertaking, one which will bring with it all of its own legal questions, but nonetheless worth flagging. I can talk about any of those prospects in more detail, but at least to get them on the table. I think what I want to turn to now is why any of this might matter, right? And of course, international criminal justice matters for a lot of reasons, not only record keeping and accountability and retribution and the kinds of usual goals we think of for criminal justice, whether it's in the domestic or the international setting. And all of those things are important, incredibly important. But in real time, with a conflict that is currently unfolding, the question is, can this actually deter in any meaningful way the conduct? And this is the subject of enormous amounts of scholarship and international debate over generations. My own view is that it depends significantly. I don't believe that international criminal justice or the prospect of international criminal justice will deter Vladimir Putin in real time. For a variety of reasons, but my own assessment is that it is unlikely to deter him. And I should say, this is speaking entirely in my personal and academic capacity and not remotely as part of an advisory board for the US State Department. So comments entirely in my personal capacity. On the other hand, I think the prospect of international criminal justice, whether in a foreign tribunal, in an international tribunal, or anywhere, can be enormously influential for commanders and other serving soldiers in the field in real time. And we've already witnessed, in some significant respect, an enormous morale collapse among Russian soldiers. They are now beginning to rely on conscripts as the military campaign goes very badly for Russia. Estimates that I've seen that seem credible suggest Russia has lost thousands of troops already. The low end of that estimate is 2,000, which is approximately what the United States lost over 20 years worth of combat in Afghanistan. These numbers, by any account, are enormous. There are credible reports of soldiers surrendering, turning themselves over to the Ukrainians, fleeing the battlefield. And commanders especially are susceptible to concerns of potential prosecution. They are the ones who are most vulnerable to potential prosecution down the road. We can hope, I think the best hope is that that the prospect of accountability down the road will help persuade some of these actors in the field to avoid involvement in ongoing war crimes. Will it persuade everyone? No. And I think my fear is the conflict is likely to get worse before it gets better in terms of violence against civilians. Just this evening, the White House warned of the prospect of chemical weapons being used, which Russia has used before. We can talk about the legality of different kinds of weapon systems, including nuclear weapons down the road, if you like. But I think best hope is that we might leverage these tools to help persuade the persuadable among the Russian forces to avoid a life imprisonment, as we have seen others suffer in post-conflict settings. At a minimum, it will be exceedingly difficult for any of these individuals to travel anywhere outside Russia for the foreseeable future, not just because of sanctions, but because of the very real threat of criminal prosecution. I think for now, maybe I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Professor Pearlstein. There was a lot in that short 8 minutes, and we'll come back to these questions, and I'm excited to see how they interact with the other areas. Right now, we're going to turn to cybersecurity with Professor Sivan Tehila, a cybersecurity expert With over 15 years of experience during her service in the Israeli Defense Forces, she fulfilled multiple positions, including intelligence officer, CISO of Research and Analysis Division, and head of the Information Security Department and Intelligence Corps. She was honorably discharged as a captain. In addition, she was an information security officer and a profiler for the Israeli defense technology company Rafael, and served as a cybersecurity consultant for the Israeli railroads. She also has dedicated herself to promoting women in cybersecurity. In addition to Cyber Ladies New York City, she developed a unique cybersecurity program for Manhattan high schools for girls. She teaches cybersecurity audit, assessment, and testing, and holds an MS in business development from Haifa University. She obtained a certified CISO from the Technion Israel Institute of Technology, and it's my great honor to introduce her here tonight. Thank you, Professor Tehila. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and for putting this important panel together. The cybersecurity front is fascinating, and even for cybersecurity professionals who are working in the field for a while, I think it's very interesting to see where it goes. Russia has a history of cyber warfare against Ukraine way before there were actual tanks on the ground, and we see now that attacks in the virtual sphere becoming one of the main fronts in this war. Cyber security professionals are particularly concerned about this conflict's potential to spill beyond the borders of the two countries. And I will provide a quick overview on the different groups that we see that acts in Russia and Ukraine, and then I'll talk about how it can affect organizations and companies in the US and then other countries in Europe. So on one side, we have Russia. Russia is a hacking superpower that began its cyber efforts against Ukraine way before the war started. And surprisingly, their activity so far has been limited. We see that it increased since the actual war started. And on the other side, we have Ukraine, which is a relative weak link in the cyberspace. Yet we see basically hundreds of thousands of tech workers inside the country who are now taking active part in the cyber attacks against Russia. There are three Russian actors, top three Russian actors that experts believe are most likely to carry out cyber attacks against European and US companies. These hacking groups are APT groups. APT, it's an advanced persistent threat, which is usually groups that work under the radar. They're typically a nation state or state-sponsored groups, which gains unauthorized access to different computer systems and remain undetected for an unexpected period. One of the groups is the UAC 0056 threat group. This group has been active since at least March 2021, and the group was observed attacking government and critical infrastructure organizations in Georgia and Ukraine. And their targets are aligned with the interests of the Russian government, although it is unknown or unclear whether it is a state-sponsored group or they're acting independently. The threat actors basically gain initial access by sending phishing email messages with a PDF or Word files, and by that they're getting access to data. They're able to encrypt some data. The other group is Sandworm Team, and they're also known as the Black Energy Group. It's a group of Russian hackers that have been behind the major cyber campaign targeting foreign government leaders and institutions, especially in Ukraine since 2009. And they also known to have a strong interest in US and European critical systems. The third group in Russia that actively hack different systems in Ukraine and the other countries around is the Gamma Radon group, and they're active since at least 2013. This is a Russian state-sponsored group. And in 2016, the group was responsible for a cyber espionage campaign that basically that was an operation that it's called the Operation Armageddon. It's known in the industry as Operation Armageddon. And this was an operation that has been active since at least mid-2013, targeting the Ukraine government, military, and law enforcement officials. So that's the Russian side. In the Ukraine side, as I mentioned, these groups are less established. They're not sponsored by the government. And the main groups we see are groups of hacktivists, hackers who are activists, and they want to support Ukraine in this cyber warfare. And the two main groups there are the Cyber Partisans, which is a group of anonymous cyber activists known as the Belarusian cyber partisans. They're based in Belarus, and they claimed last week to have hacked into the Belarusian railways computer system in a bid to sabotage the deployment of Russian military units in the country. And they, of course, did it because they believe that Belarus, and we understand that Belarus may play a crucial role in this war. The second interesting group is the Anonymous Collective, which we know that most of the members in Anonymous are basically Russian-based hackers. Still, the Anonymous Collective declared cyber war against the Russian government last week, and around 30 minutes later, they announced that they have taken down the website of the Kremlin-backed TV channel, which broadcasts in Britain and has been heavily criticized for its coverage. This chaotic situation, as I mentioned before, can really affect companies, especially companies who have their network and tech workers and servers in Ukraine. I know personally many Israeli startups who develop, who basically outsource their development, and they have people in Russia and Ukraine, and they really had to deal with a very weird situation. On one end, they had to take care of their people to make sure that everyone's safe. That's the priority for any company who operates there. But on the other end, they had to really worry about their IP, their intellectual property, their code, their systems, and also, as my colleague here on the panel mentioned, that the fact that they couldn't wire money. So basically, ideally, any company should have BCP and DRP plans in place. BCP is business continuity plan, and DRP is disaster recovery plan. And that should be one of the main aspects when you build a cybersecurity strategy for almost any company. But like, we didn't expect the pandemic to be to affect companies like we saw 2 years ago, when companies had to shift overnight to remote work and to implement new security solutions and different methods to be able to communicate with each other. In the same way, many of the companies that operate in Russia and Ukraine didn't include this kind of war as part of their business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan. And now they basically need to rethink the way they work and how it can affect them moving forward. The other interesting aspect here, also related to cryptocurrencies, we see that hackers basically take advantage of the situation to basically do more, hack more US-based companies and other companies that have some assets in Ukraine. And the way that hackers basically, for example, in a ransomware attack, they encrypt the data of a specific company and then they ask to pay ransom. And the way they ask to get the money is, of course, with Bitcoin. So this all situation makes many companies now buy cryptocurrencies just in case they'll need to handle a situation. And of course that paying ransomware is not recommended at all. It can affect in the future on the company in terms of the premium they pay for cyber insurance and also after you pay ransomware, you're becoming a very attractive target in the future for potential other hackers. I can discuss ransomware and all the other effects of this situation for many hours, but I would like to wrap up with some few tips for US-based organizations and institutions. The nation's Cyber Defense Agency, CISA, published guidelines to help organizations and individuals to basically prepare for, respond to, and mitigate the impact of cyber attacks. I will also send you the link here. And to prepare for potential cyber attacks or threats to critical assets, there are few main simple things that companies can do. So first, in this age when everyone's working remotely, we have great remote access security solutions. So basically the CISA recommend to validate all the remote access solutions, or what we used to call, what we know also as VPNs, to implement and enable multi-factor authentication for individual accounts and also for any organizational critical application, to make sure that you have updated software and all levels, and backups are very important as well. We see that many companies who didn't have good backups for their data, they're basically, I think that some companies won't be able to survive this war, and that's why backups is a highly recommended act to do for any organization, and of course some other controls. And maybe the most important thing here is to be able to respond to cybersecurity incidents in real time. One of the critical aspects when you are under attack is how fast you identify the attack and how fast you respond to hackers in order to make sure that that the hackers are not able to access multiple segments or multiple places where you store the data. There is a new model called Zero Trust model that many companies are now implementing. The whole concept of Zero Trust model is to basically never trust anyone, but always verify the identity of the people who are getting access to the network. And it includes three main components. First, we identify the device, and we verify the identity of the user, and then we basically create microsegmentation of the network, which means that we're creating preventing unauthorized users from moving literally in the environment. So if an unauthorized user or an hacker got access to a specific segment in the network, it doesn't mean that the whole companies is under a risk. So I highly recommend to any decision maker and any CEO or anyone who works in the industry, and also for individuals to follow the CISA guides. And I'm happy to answer any other questions later in our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Tehila. Appreciate that. That's again, we really have covered very complex areas in a very short amount of time. There's some excellent questions that have been filtering in here. I'm going to try to synthesize some of them. I think one of the main senses that we have sitting here in the comfort of our homes, in the security of the cities that we live in, realizing this war is unfolding very far away, and there's a sense of helplessness. There's a sense of trying to wrap our heads around this, trying to figure out ways to help. I want to first point out that YU students have taken a lead on this. There's a wonderful project to help refugees in Europe. A group of students will be going very soon, and we have many ongoing efforts in those very hands-on practical spheres, helping people face to face, obviously sending money and obviously sending food and everything else. But of these areas, what things work? I'm thinking, sanctions. We've had sanctions on Cuba for a very long time. It hasn't seemed to have gotten the effect we wanted. Sanctions on Iran, has that affected? Will sanctions work here? The legal war front is so essential for our humanity, but as Professor Pearlstein talked about the limits of it, and with the cyber seems to just be constantly evolving, and it's a constant flowing situation. Any thoughts on that? What we could do as citizens on these fronts, whether that's through advocacy or that's through, I'm not really sure, our choices, and what can we push our governments to do? I know it's a big open-ended question, and you all dealt with it in many ways, but if you can kind of, I'll turn it over to whoever wants to start.
So I guess I'll start. I see some of the questions in the chat about what can we do more practically and so forth, and those are great questions. There are incredible humanitarian aid organizations that are working very actively in the field, both with refugees and trying to provide humanitarian relief. And so better than us, right? That we're academics, right? You should go to those NGOs. Some of them are terrific. There's Save the Children, there's CARE, there are others that are working globally, and we can provide more information about those if you like, but I think that's the best way to do that. In terms of the issues I was talking about, I think there are two things that come right to the top of my mind just on accountability issues. One is, well, Germany and many other states have universal jurisdiction war crime statutes. That is, if any of these perpetrators come into their territory, they are subject or potentially subject to criminal prosecution. The United States' own war crime statute, although we have a war crimes federal criminal law on the books, and it's a pretty good one, doesn't extend its jurisdiction universally. So it only applies if either the perpetrator or the victim of the attack is a national of the United States. So if one of these commanders or soldiers or so forth who was actually responsible for what's going on here steps foot in the United States, perhaps there's some criminal liability that we could attach to them that is not obvious. It is a small amendment to a single statute that it would require. Congress seems at the moment rather seized of the issue. It seems to me like a useful opportunity to fill that loophole in our law so that we're not one of the states in the world in which war criminals can seek safe harbor. That shouldn't be what the United States is at a minimum, and it's a small change we can make in our law to ensure that we're not. The second thing is, and this is a question, I think, as well for Sivan, there are groups that are working now on the ground and that are extremely technically skilled at capturing, the war watching unfold in real time. And as you see in your own social media, not just Sivan, but everyone, right, in their own social media universes, in their own YouTube sites, in their own sort of family connections and so forth, for those who are going to work with refugees in your own experiences, you can help with that too by connecting to other sites with the social media companies and others. I've been pleased to see their aggressive work to take down horrific acts of violence to the extent that they celebrate, might have the effect of celebrating those acts in real time. But we need to make sure that what's being deleted by those companies or removed from their sites are nonetheless saved. Because this information becomes important down the road. So I don't know if there's anything more you can say about that. I'd also be interested in the question that I saw somebody raise in the chat about why so far Russia's cyber warfare attacks and indeed disinformation campaigns seem rather less aggressive than many might have anticipated leading up to this conflict. So I'll stop there.
Sivan, you want to take that question about what the sites can do or what they're doing?
Yeah, so maybe I should go back to what I started with, and basically all these Russian hacking groups are very established and they're nation-sponsored, and they are around for a while. They don't really need to act heavily now or to do any dramatic actions. They may already present inside so many critical infrastructures in Ukraine, waiting for what we call the 0 day and just waiting for an order to act. And we see that in many nation-sponsored cyber groups. So I'll try not to touch in very sensitive points, but going back to, I think I saw a question here about critical infrastructures. Critical infrastructures are railways, airplanes, other healthcare systems. I'm sure that the Russian government targeting all these places, and they might use it in the right time. So far, I think they have other decisions to make. So making a decision on a cyber attack, it's usually much easier when you have everything ready. It's only about like providing an order. You don't need to really have tanks on the ground, soldiers to plan where you're getting from. But on the other end, it can be very dangerous. I heard many people say this week that that cyber war is more that maybe we should move to the cyberspace when we're getting into wars in the world. But we need to remember that critical infrastructure, if you affect them by hacking them, it can also cause some there is a human life issues here as well. If you're basically getting access to the signaling system of a train, you can cause an accident between trains. You can, if you shut down the electricity in some countries in a specific time when you're planning to bomb a specific target, it has like a very significant aspect here. So I believe that their cyber effort is they started the cyber warfare way before the actual war started, and I believe they have some plans around this. And since they have so many sponsored, very active groups, then government might not focus on this right now, but it will be interesting to see where it goes.
Wow. It's frightening. Professor Kahn, do you want to?
I got cut out momentarily, and I somehow came back on as Deborah.
Okay. Okay. But well, I mean, I'll even say this one question here from anonymous. I hope it's not the hacker. Professor Kahn, to what degree do you think the sanctions, if you listen to them, have teeth? What do you see as the near and medium term impact of on Russian GDP, with only US and UK materially limiting Russian oil purchases? You touched on this, but what has teeth? what can actually do something? I guess short term, long term, right? I'll leave that.
So they clearly have teeth, especially in the short term, because there's a tremendous disruption, especially domestically, and people not being able to use their credit cards and having to take cash out of the banks, which has an impact on the financial system. And so the question is to what extent Russia will be able to, in a reasonable amount of time, mitigate those effects. The government is probably first and foremost concerned with their own viability, and that would include the central bank and the government's ability to function. But some of the intent of sanctions, as maybe cruel as it may sound, is to damage, and as another person in the chat made this point, they hurt the Russian people. And the part of the goal is to make the war sufficiently unpopular that it puts pressure on Putin to come to the bargaining table or make a deal. And so that gets to the other question of what can be done. Beyond humanitarian aid, I'm not sure how much we can do as individuals, but it seems to me the best hope is some kind of quick diplomatic resolution. And to the extent Putin starts to feel pressure at home because the Russian people themselves are suffering economically, that may be the most positive, if you can use that word, impact of the sanctions. In terms of impact on GDP, I've seen numbers of as much as 20% decline in Russian GDP because of these disruptions. So the impact is like, how long that lasts. Again, my hunch is that they will find ways around them over time. And so if they get through this short-term crisis, they will be able to cope with them to some extent. But the hope is that the short-term crisis brings about some kind of diplomatic resolution.
So, Ronnie, I'd like to address your question about hopelessness and helplessness that people feel, and also touches on what Deb said and what James Kahn said, and that is what can we do as citizens of the world and as people who understand history and feel very deeply for those people in Ukraine. There are a number of organizations raising money for people who are refugees in Europe and beyond, and Ukrainians themselves. And I'm thinking of UNICEF, Save the Children, the International Rescue Committee, the Orthodox Union. All of these organizations, Doctors Without Borders, we can feel confident that the money we send will get to people and will not be tied up in bureaucracy. And people are in great need. And I do encourage people to think about making a contribution to help the people who are so badly in pain right now.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, there's definitely, at least there's that we can do. I think we have time for, there are a bunch of other questions. There's one specific question here from Eric Roski's for Professor Pearlstein. I was very moved reading Chris Dodd's book, Letters from Nuremberg, regarding his father serving as prosecutor at Nuremberg. What thoughts do you have about an eventual process like that with regard to Russian actions? Is there a Justice Jackson ready to serve in such a role? Could you take us somewhere there?
Yeah, thanks. So that's a fine question, and I'll mention that the last surviving American prosecutor who served in Nuremberg, a man named Ben Ferenc, is still alive. He's just over 100 years old now, and he helped endow the Human Rights Clinic at the law school at Cardozo. And he's spoken to my international law students as well. He's a fascinating man with an extraordinary life. I'm sure that there are other Justice Jacksons to be had. Justice Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, wrote some of the most famous and most eloquent opinions that the court has had during the 20th century. But he also left his day job to some extent to go serve as the chief U.S. prosecutor for the Americans at Nuremberg. I think that the personnel are here, right? Americans we have a lot of wonderful international lawyers and a rich and vibrant international legal community. I think the greater challenge for the United States in the last 20 plus years has been balancing the American government's very serious concerns about exposing their own soldiers, our own soldiers, to liability for war crimes in front of an international community, against the pressing need for some fixed and standing capability to reliably pursue international criminal justice when conflicts arise. So the United States, although the United States initially signed on to the Rome Statute, it never became a party. It very actively worked against the proliferation of states signing on to the International Criminal Court, and continued to do that in the last administration. The Biden administration has moved back from that a little bit, but one doesn't need to necessarily embrace the ICC and view this as the solution to all of our problems. The ICC is a new institution and has ample flaws of its own, but we at least need to not be the enemies of justice of this kind. And I think we could do a lot better. I think Justice Jackson might hope we could do a lot better, at least promoting this and promoting adherence to the rule of law, not just in the United States, but internationally.
Thank you. This has been a really special evening. Thank you. And there's more to study and more to think about and more to figure out how we could be better citizens here. And I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of our sponsors tonight. I want to let everyone know that the recording will be up in a few days. I put it into the chat, and I can do that again. It'll be on the Crisis and Hope webpage at YU, where you can find last week's. This coming week, we have a very special program coming up on Tuesday evening with Rabbi Yosef Blau, Professor Suzanne Last-Stone, and Professor Joseph Luters, talking about freedom, human rights, and Jewish values, and the fight for them. And so I really look forward to that. So we'll check in, look out for the notice for that. And it'll be at the same yu.edu, YU Voices site, and that'll be Tuesday at 8 o'clock. We also have coming up, we'll have one session on with psychologists and social workers discussing trauma and repair, and another one on culture, focusing on the very special little port city of Odessa coming up, and that'll be a really special program as well. And thank you so much for coming, for being a part of this. To each one of you and the panelists, to Provost Botman, thank you. It's been a very special night. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thanks to everyone, and thanks to you, Ronnie Perelis, for your leadership in this work as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night. Take good care.